someplace it said algae, right? That's why everyone's here. They're all excited about this, I can tell. You know, pond scum. I mean, I can talk about it for hours, but I only have 15 minutes. So, and I'll explain to you how energy has kind of gone through the arc of my life from the very beginning to being a hippie graduate student in Berkeley to working for the military industrial complex now. What kind of energy am I talking about? I'm talking about, you know, the physical, chemical kind of energy, the one that makes things glow and makes things move, and you know, I get excited about this kind of energy. And I did as a young kid. So as a young kid, I grew up in a railroad town in upstate New York, an old railroad town. Lots of trains going through, and they impress you with their energy when you're, you know, about this tall, about 2 feet tall, and the engine is 8 feet tall, thundering by you. The tracks all over town, whistles going all the time. It was an exciting place to be. And I guess from the very beginning, I've always been interested in what makes things work, what makes things tick. So I started out at a relatively early age, 6 or 7, doing experiments, you know, taking things apart to see how they work. Of course, my first result was that I realized much easier to take things apart than it is to put them back together again. And maybe I shouldn't have done this experiment on my great-grandfather's golden pocket watch. But after that, I waited. I said, okay, you're going to throw that away? Give it to me. I'll take it apart. Maybe I can fix it. At least I'll know what's inside and how it works. And so I've done that ever since, really. Nothing I like better than a dead machine. But I was aided in this really by my grandfather, who was really quite a guy. Bill Pryor. His real name was Winfred. He hated that. Everyone called him Bill. He born in 1900 in this small town in upstate New York. So he was there at the beginning of our new energy era, really. And he taught himself. He didn't really finish high school until about the time I did, I guess, because he quit school and went to work in the first automobile garage in town to learn how cars work. He learned how electricity works and was the guy that wired the first streetlights in town. And then he learned how gas works, and he put the gas lines in, right? So here was a man I could learn a lot from, and he did teach me quite a bit. I think I was 4 or 5. I had a tall stool on his workbench. He was showing me how to pound in nails. Another time, you know, sometimes I'd help him when he was fixing things. If something was hard to get to, like the nut on the back of a washing machine, he'd put the wrench in my hand and he'd grab my feet and just lower me over the side and say, "Here, Pat, tighten this up." And when it got time to learn how to to work with electricity, he said, "Well, before I show you how to do this," maybe I was around 10, so 1960 or so, "I want to see what kind of a guy you are in terms of electricity. You know, here's a couple wires, touch these." And I touched them, and wow, did I get a shock. I jumped away, and he said, "Oh, good, you're the kind that jumps away. You don't hold on. I can work with you. I can work with you." So, yeah, so I learned, he taught me electricity. And really, he fed my curiosity. He, you know, kind of taught me you can go out and learn about things and figure it out and, you know, play around, be careful what you're doing, and maybe you can get things to work for you, you know, or you can learn new things. And another significant event, and you'll see how this kind of plays out through my life, was I was also big on reading. I was a big reader. And one time I was sick, I was feverish, or maybe it was from the book I was reading, I don't know. I was reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is an old edition with all the Latin names for the organisms and everything. It was fantastic. You know, I was in bed reading it, well, don't tell my mom, with a candle under the covers, right? So I'd have some light. But anyway, this book was really inspiring. Here was Captain Nemo. He had this Nautilus that he could drive around under the oceans. He had invented a new kind of energy, right? He discovered an energy, limitless source of sustainable energy. This is a real dream. And Verne was writing this in the 1870s or something, and even then he was talking about what's going to happen when we run out of coal. Of course, he didn't know we were going to discover oil, but still, we're going to run out of oil, right? So we need to, I was thinking then, we need to have this kind of energy that Nemo was dreaming about, right? He had found a way to get energy out of water. Not steam energy, but a way to take water apart. Water is H2O, right? Hydrogen and oxygen. So if you can take water apart, you can have hydrogen, which is a very good fuel. right? It's used to take rockets into space, basically, right? So it's an excellent fuel. And so this was a dream I'm still working on, I guess, but it's taken me a while. Probably the next stage I went through in high school was chemistry. This is a kind of chemistry. Chemistry is kind of interesting. You know, what can you do with chemistry? Lots of things. You can do lots of fun things. And of course, being an adolescent boy, I was interested in how to make gunpowder and fuses that burn underwater and all this kind of stuff that you can discover. You can read about in your mother's chemistry, college chemistry textbook, right? I mean, you can figure it out and then fake a note from the teacher to get potassium nitrate from the pharmacy and all this stuff. But anyway, I didn't really blow anything up. I survived, and the rest of my family members survived too. Really. So continuing on my quest for just gathering information, and I still do that, So my wife will say sometimes, "How do you know that?" I don't know, but I read it or heard it or something. I mean, I'm trying to understand everything. I went to university and did 4 years, studied physics and philosophy because that's really kind of the basis for how things work, either on one side or the other, right? But when I finished physics, I said, well, it was fun to learn that, just like it's fun to learn philosophy, but what can I really do with that? And so I went to graduate school in Berkeley and decided I'd do biophysics because this is a way to kind of recycle physicists who don't really want to do that. They want to do biology, but they don't have a biology degree. You can kind of go there and become a generalist, and that's kind of what happened to me. And that's where I ran into my mentor and who was going to introduce me to algae. Right, and which I've worked with on and off ever since. And so I went to join his lab, and it was at a lab party, and they give me this. Here's a brownie with this, this green stuff in it. I'm going, really? Well, of course, this is Berkeley in the '70s, and here we're in Colorado, but it's not what you think. This was algae in there, right? Spirulina. This was the rite of passage to join the group, because it was an algae group. You have to eat this stuff. Well, spirulina is good for you, right? 70% protein, and it's been harvested since ancient times by the Mexicans, et cetera, as a food source. But I joined the lab, and my mentor, John Benman, introduced me to algae, which are really wonderful organisms. I mean, they're single-cell plants, right? So they have figured out a way to capture solar energy, use this energy to grow on water, carbon dioxide, and a few minerals dissolved in the water. And then they can just grow, right, and reproduce and make more and more and more until the pond is covered with scum. But also, the thing you're learning or you're trying to understand, or what I like to do is I want to understand the process, and even if it's a biological process, these things, these single-cell organisms, are really like, well, very highly programmed entities, right? They go by some kind of programming. So you try to figure out a way to trick them, to change, to use their programming to do something you want instead of what they normally do. And that was the idea. Could we use this kind of system to make this dream come true, to make hydrogen from water, right? Normally a plant, when they do photosynthesis, will take water from wherever they are, and algae grow in it, and they'll break it apart. They'll make the oxygen, right? Everyone knows that oxygen comes from plants, right? The oxygen we breathe, and they're left with protons and electrons that then they use to fix CO2. But can we do something so instead you combine the electrons with the protons? That'll give you hydrogen gas, right? A fuel. So you figure out a way to change what they're doing to your benefit. It's not to their benefit. So some of these organisms can normally do this kind of reaction, take what they want from the water, and they can use these protons and electrons to take the N2, the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and make ammonia, right? And then everyone around them is happy. They got fixed nitrogen to grow, the plants, and then the animals can eat those plants, right? So you need someplace an organism that can do this. Well, it turns out if you take some of these kinds of algae and you take away the N2, right, the nitrogen, then what are they going to do with the protons and electrons? What happens is they put them together and they make hydrogen, and it bubbles out of the solution. And there you go, you've got hydrogen. But this brings me back to, I'm a scientist and not an engineer, right? So I'm a dreamer, and I start at the very beginning. Is something possible? This is what I'm interested in. Can you demonstrate something that's never been demonstrated before? Here's what you think you understand about the system. Can you make some changes so that you see something different, right? And maybe you'll see something, a very small amount for a very short period of time, and you're very happy. But engineers, so this is the kind of the science of the possible. Engineers practice the art of the practical, right? So you need an engineer now, once you've discovered something, to, can we really make this work so that everyone can use it and so that it's economical? So we still have many barriers before we really can get algae to make hydrogen for us. But I've been kind of working on this on and off over the years, and attention, wavering up and down like a roller coaster, basically following the roller coaster of funding, right? This is what happens when you're a scientist. You might have great ideas and you really want to do something, but if you don't have the money to buy the equipment and the chemicals and everything you need, you can't do it. And it turns out governments usually don't have long-term vision. You have an oil crisis in the 70s, and that's when I was a graduate student. Okay, here's a lot of money to work on alternative renewable energy, and you do that for a little while, and then, oh, hey, we got lots of oil. Forget the funding. Do something else. So on and off, I've been working on this, ever since, I guess, trying to get algae to make hydrogen or trying to get bacteria. I mean, you can take bacteria and waste materials, and you can get interesting things out of waste materials, and sometimes you can get hydrogen out of waste materials, out of kitchen scraps, things like this, right? And a lot of people are working on this. I mean, hydrogen could be a good fuel source, and most of the major car companies are working on hydrogen fueled vehicles, but they never discuss where are we going to get this hydrogen. And it turns out 90% of the hydrogen that you can buy on the market comes from fossil fuels. So it's not really interesting as a sustainable or renewable energy. So I have a real appreciation for algae, and I think you should too, right? Because without algae, you would not be alive. None of us would be alive, right? Algae basically made the oxygen in the atmosphere about 2.5 billion years ago. We can't really tell for sure because they're little microscopic things. You don't see fossils. So this is way back, way before the dinosaurs, in the middle of the Precambrian, right? At the beginning, right the middle of the Archean period of time. Somewhere at that point, the first algae, or well, before that a little bit, because once you see enough oxygen, there's a lot of them out there. One algae figured out how to do this process, how to take the sunlight and split the water into oxygen and protons and electrons, right? And you think they were clever, but really, we always say we stand on the shoulders of giants. They took what other bacteria had already developed earlier, who hadn't figured out how to do this with water, but were using the sunlight anyway in their own kind of way to gain energy. And the algae had figured out a way to put these two together and then split water. So 2.5 billion years ago, we have the first algae. We have oxygen, what we would call the great oxygen catastrophe, because it wiped out most of the life on Earth. Most of the life couldn't stand the oxygen, right? It's a toxic substance. But anyway, it made our life possible. And finally, a few things about algae, because I'll finish up, and I'm still working on them. I'm collecting algae in the Arctic and studying them, and Arctic in the hot springs and studying them, and out in the desert and studying them, because they're all over the Earth. They've colonized everywhere in different forms. One thing people don't realize when you buy gas or liquid oil, that these are really fossil algae, right? These are algae that were buried millions of years ago. And so one of the dreams I have is to use algae to make fuel now and not have to wait for millions of years. So in addition to hydrogen, you can get some algae that will make basically an oil that you can make a biodiesel from, right? And even an even greater dream would be to find algae that could make some kind of jet fuel, right? Because cars and trucks, we can drive eventually with electricity, which should be renewably generated, right? I mean, this is what bugs me about electric cars. They're good if the electricity is renewable. But, you know, if you're plugging in your car from Drake, I'm not sure how good this is, right? So, but jet fuel, we need a liquid fuel to drive jets. There's no choice. You can't have a battery in a jet airplane, right? So maybe we can get algae to do this. I'm still dreaming.